Well, welcome to the first live federal policy briefing from the NAGC office here in Washington, D.C. Over 300 people tell us that they plan to join us on this webinar and participate in the conversation about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Just to cover a little bit of logistics for this convening. First, we will entertain a few questions at the end of our session, but you can actually submit those questions beforehand. A few people have already emailed Jane and me, and we'll take more throughout the session. To do so, if you have a Google Plus account and are on the YouTube account, you can access the Join the Conversation button that is on your screen. When you click that, it will take you to an opportunity either to sign in to Google, or if you already are signed into Google, you can click on the top right corner a little grid that will allow you to activate the Q&A button. The next way to submit a question is to go to Twitter and use your Twitter hashtag NAGC lowercase q 17. And then finally, a third way to allow you to submit a question. Why don't you email directly Kathleen Healy at chealy@nagc.org. We will not be able to answer every single question during this webinar, but we will be tracking the questions and updating our own Q&A page as we go along and learn more about this law. Finally, the archive of this webinar, this video, will be available on YouTube, on the NAGC website at www.nagc.org, and also on the NAGC YouTube page, which is youtube.com/NAGC Gifted, all one word. So today we're going to be discussing the Every Student Succeeds Act. As you know, this Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, reauthorizes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It really updates and evolves President Bush's signature piece of legislation called the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, and then is a direct reaction to President Obama's implementation of the expired NCLB. Let me tell you a little bit about federal education law for those that are new to the discussion. As you know, federal education law way back when started with the National Defense Education Act as a reaction to Sputnik and our call to make sure that we're preparing enough mathematicians, engineers, scientists to actually focus on and lead in our global economy. ESSA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, is Lyndon Baines Johnson's War on Poverty. That was sparked with an effort to really eradicate poverty in a real way through one of the most important strategies of education. Fast forward to 2001, there are several reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act put into place by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and we end up with No Child Left Behind. This law was prompted by the President, George H.W. Bush, to eliminate achievement gaps between white students who are more affluent and those that are from poverty or disadvantaged backgrounds, such as minorities and English language learners. Now we get to ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. You know, it's only a 7-day-old law, and here at NAGC, we're trying to make sure that we educate people about what we know at this point about the law. But we do know a couple things about it so far. First is that it maintains the commitment to equity that has existed since ESSA. And really, in terms of the reaction to No Child Left Behind, and the implementation, it's to restore local control. In this law, we have an opportunity and are really excited here at NAGC that it finally addresses the needs of gifted and talented students, or students with extraordinary gifts and talents in our school systems. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce my partner here on this webinar and leader of most of NAGC's efforts to improve federal law and policy, Jane Clarenbach. Jane Clarenbach is NAGC's Director of Public Education. She is our chief advocate on the Hill here in Washington and has spent over a decade with us really making sure that this law is improved and recognizes the needs of gifted and talented students. I want to pause here before we move on to some of the details of the law and ask you a little bit about what that decade of service has meant. How has our work here at NAGC evolved and turned into ESSA?
Thanks, Renee. Well, I would first say that a lot of the traction we've been able to get in the last decade has been due to challenges that No Child Left Behind presented. That relentless focus on proficiency was a tremendous asset for struggling learners, but for those, and our community knows this, for those students who are at or above proficiency, the law seemed to ignore them and in fact distract schools from working with advanced learners. Fortunately, there were members of Congress who grasped that early and were willing to work with us on bringing the needs of gifted and talented learners and the obstacles that they faced in No Child Left Behind to the forefront. And most recently, the legislation that advocates across the country, along with NAGC, have been supporting is the Talent Act. The most recent iteration of the Talent Act was sponsored or is sponsored. The legislation still exists, but the longtime congressional supporters, Senator Grassley of Iowa, Mikulski of Maryland, Casey of Pennsylvania, two new members who have joined in support of the Talent Act to sponsor it were Bozeman of Arkansas and Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. And over in the House, we have enjoyed the longtime support of Jared Polis of Colorado and a new member of Congress, David Young of Iowa. What's important to know there from a congressional perspective is that this is one of very rare education bills that enjoyed bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. It's something that I think can be explained by not only the efforts of our advocates to educate members of Congress, but also that concerns for the range of learners in the classroom and what the nation is hoping for from kids when they leave K-12 education is not really a partisan issue. And so I'm very pleased, obviously, that the goals of the Talent Act were incorporated into ESSA this time through the Every Child or Every Student Succeeds Act. The principles of the Talent Act were always about increasing data in order to make decisions about gifted and talented students, increasing teacher training so that more teachers understand what giftedness looks like in the classroom and how to respond, attention to high ability children in low income settings, and fourth, continuing research that allows us to continue developing best classroom practices. Each of those priorities from the Talent Act have been included in the ESSA. It's a huge success for the advocates around the country.
Well, I want to personally thank all of those members of Congress on the House and the Senate that have been so dedicated and committed to supporting the needs of gifted and talented students. But I also want to thank you. You have persistently led all of our advocates here at NAGC, all of our members, to develop the policies and support and educate the members of Congress to get there and make these important changes and recognize the needs of gifted and talented students. So thank you for your long-standing work and successes. They're yours too.
Thank you.
So we're gonna cover a couple different pieces of the law today, of the new law. We're gonna cover Title I and the changes, the implications for gifted and talented. Mm-hmm. Title II, which is the professional development portion of the law, or improving teacher quality part of the law. And then we'll talk a little bit about competitive grant program in the Jacob Javits Gifted and Talented Education program. So let me start with Title I. For those in the audience that are new to how exactly federal policy, federal law, federal funding actually work, I just want to explain that Title I is a formula-funded program that goes out to states and districts. States are the primary grantees, but there's also a formula that goes out to districts based on poverty counts and counts of poverty among students. In those school systems that receive Title I funds, they have a couple different options. One is to provide targeted assistance programs where they can serve those that are in poverty with the funding in Title I and follow the rules and follow all the different types of programmatic supports that are available through Title I. But then there are also school-wide schools, which will allow students that may be more affluent or have more means above the poverty level, not receive a free and reduced price lunch, to also access some of these, as long as there's a sufficient concentration of students in poverty within those schools and within those districts. Now that we have an opportunity with ESSA put some very specific language about gifted and talented students and serving them in Title I. This is a first time. Can you tell us a little bit more about what some of those changes in the law are and what the potential impact will be for students?
Sure. There are two additions to note in Title I. The first, and which has the potential to be very long-lasting and high impact, is the additional data reporting requirements. We were not able to make gifted and talented students a new subgroup for whom schools need to collect data. However, what we were able to secure was that the student achievement data that comes from the annual state assessments, and the law does require, continues No Child Left Behind's required testing of students from grades 3 to 8 and once in high school in reading and in math. So that testing regime will continue, and the data that results from those tests must be reported on the state and local report cards, disaggregated by student subgroup at each achievement level. And that's the change that we were able to secure. Prior to this, the only disaggregated data that was required to be reported were for students who were at proficient or below. Now, although the states and districts presumably collected all of the data, they were not reporting it because they weren't required to. There probably wasn't a box on the state report card that goes on the websites to report all of your data. So from now on, we'll be able to see at the local level and at the state level what percentage of students are achieving at the advanced level on the state assessment, and from what populations those students are coming from. That will provide an annual conversation about what are the implications of what our data results look like, who's achieving and who isn't achieving. Clearly, a tremendous opportunity to continue conversations with policymakers about educational decisions for advanced learners.
So here at NAGC, we know that giftedness or high intellectual abilities and potential exist in all populations of students, whether you are economically disadvantaged, whether you come from a minority background, or even English language learners. And we want to make sure that we don't mask their gifts and talents, their extraordinary gifts and talents, and just overlook them. And this law and this provision, you think will actually help uncover some of that?
Well, I think so, especially that the LEAs, the local education agencies. So if I refer to LEA, that's what we mean. Sometimes we say districts, sometimes we say LEAs, but we mean the same thing. I think we might be able to relate this to the impact that No Child Left Behind had on school districts when they disaggregated their most struggling learner data. There were surprises. There were a lot of school districts that, or I should say there were communities that were surprised that their school districts had so many struggling learners and what the makeup of those groups were. I think we will find that school districts are surprised about who is not achieving at the advanced level. The work that Dr. Jonathan Plucker started years ago, 2010, on the excellence gap, he coined that term to describe the differences between populations at the advanced level. His work focused at the state level, and now we'll have local level data. And I think that will be a tremendous opportunity for parents and teachers and others who care about advanced students to ask some really challenging questions about why all the children that should be at the advanced level aren't at the advanced level.
So now the benefits that we realized under NCLB to shine a spotlight on those achievement gaps, we'll actually be able to bring to that excellence gap and find out who's achieving at the highest level and how we can support them, those students from all the different populations, to be able to demonstrate their achievement.
Right, and I think that we have research. Thankfully, there's a lot of Javits-based research and other research that does provide clues, and in fact, more than clues in some cases, about how to work with students in poverty and English language learners. How do we assess them and support them so to achieve at advanced levels? So the work is beginning, but I'm confident that when the data is available, we'll be able to change the way schools operate in behalf of gifted kids.
Well, you mentioned two things that changed in Title I. Can you share the other?
Well, speaking of disadvantaged learners, currently school districts do not spend their Title I money on gifted and talented learners. And the change in ESSA is that Congress specifically included an allowance that Title I funds may be used, of course, again, as Renee said, not district-wide, but in the Title I supported programs and school buildings, Title I funds may be used to support gifted and talented learners. This is an enormous sea change or potential. There are, unfortunately, as we all know, huge myths, very damaging myths about the abilities of low-income children. And the field of gifted and talented education has developed strategies over the years to work directly with that program. Of course, they haven't been using their Title I money, but they've been using gifted education strategies. So there is a lot of re-education that will have to be done to be sure that everyone understands that this change is occurring. And I would like to believe that implicit in the language that was included in ESEA is that understanding that go ahead, do it. Let's look for giftedness in low-income populations. So for me, this is a provision from the Talent Act, and we as advocates can use it as a way to educate school leaders that every school has gifted and talented students in it. And if they're in your low income, even if you're a low income community, you have gifted children, and they very likely need something different than their classmates. And Again, the gifted ed body of research can help inform those classroom and school-wide practices.
So while spending federal funds on gifted and talented programs wasn't necessarily prohibited by the past law, this law and this Congress was explicit in saying that gifted and talented education and support services can be offered in Title I programs.
That's right.
So that's great and potentially very powerful, as you said, with the combination of data that shows us where giftedness occurs, and now in kind of continuing our spirit of equity that has existed with ESEA from its beginning, hopefully bringing equity to high achievement as well. So, let's move on to Title II. Title II is one of my favorite, as you know. I've spent many years focusing on improving teaching quality in my work at the U.S. Department of Ed and beyond. But through Title II, there are some new provisions which are aimed at improving the quality of teaching and teachers and skills of those that are supporting the needs of gifted and talented students. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, it also includes principals and referred to as other school leaders. So presumably that could be other district level personnel that may need some professional learning to stay on the cutting edge. The law itself focuses on increased academic achievement. So much of the language of Title II is linked to teacher and principal training related to their ability to help students increase their achievement. There are 3 new provisions in Title II. 2 are required, and 1 is what we call an allowable use for the Title II funds. The first is related to states, and in preparation to receive Title II funds, states submit plans to the U.S. Department of Education. Beginning in somewhere between 2016 and 2017, we still have to learn these things. 7 days old.
The law's only 7 days old.
Right. But from the implementation of this law, once it begins for Title II, states must include a description of how the state is going to take action to ensure that teachers in the state, teachers and principals, and so I'll just say teachers from now on, develop the skills needed to address the specific learning needs of gifted students, and there are some other students listed on that list. But as importantly as how to identify those needs, they also have to ensure that the teachers have the skills to be able to provide instruction in response to those needs. So how that implementation will look in each state is going to vary dramatically, but right off the bat, there's that opportunity for advocates to ask questions about how is our state going to ensure this new requirement. It will be new to the Title II directors in the states. You know, they'll be combing through the law and looking and hopefully looking for advice from the community, but there's the opportunity for advocates. States must do this, and it's a golden opportunity for consultation.
And really, it's the requirement there is to support educators, principals, as you said, school leaders, teacher leaders, and classroom teachers to figure out how to increase student achievement. By calling on the needs of gifted and talented students, we need to remind everyone that they have a need and an opportunity and a right to learn more than they already know.
Right. Del Figley refers to that as gifted students have a right to learn something new every day.
Exactly.
Right.
And so hopefully this law inspires education leaders at the district level and at the state level to think carefully about the professional development that they are offering their teachers, those who have direct access to gifted and talented students who may be assigned to gifted and talented programs. But we also know that the majority of students who are gifted and talented are in regular education environments. And so having that exposure, that understanding about how to support and develop the skills of those high achieving learners is something that all teachers will need.
Right. I like to think of it as academic diversity. We address a range of diversity in our priorities for teacher research, teacher professional learning, research too. But I think of gifted and talented students in the regular classroom as a form of diversity, in this case academic diversity, that we're calling attention to in the state plans. If I could tell you about the other requirements in Title II address the school districts themselves. So if a school district receives Title II money, they must also use those funds to do a whole range of things. But the requirement is they must address the learning needs of gifted and talented students. That's it. Those are the words. I'm not leaving anything out. It's that short, but it's very clear. And it's the first statement. They must address the learning needs of all students, including gifted and talented students. Again, without any details, there's a wonderful opportunity for consultation with the community about just how will a school district that receives Title II, in fact, implement that section. Clues to how they might implement that section come later in Title II. School districts are also allowed to use their Title II funds in a number of ways. And one of the ways is to identify and serve gifted and talented students. And interestingly, this provision from the Talent Act is included almost verbatim. The gifted and talented students they can focus on, their teacher preparation funds, would be high ability students who have not been identified as gifted. And the reason that language was in the Talent Act is particularly for low income communities where school leaders say we don't have any gifted children in our building, therefore we don't have gifted and talented programs. Very sad thought, but not
a sad myth.
Not as uncommon, unfortunately, as we all wish it were. So it's to draw attention to the fact that there are high ability students in your school that may not have been identified as gifted. And then the section in Title II goes on to say that they also should provide instructional services training for the teachers. And they give a couple of examples, such as acceleration, enrichment, dual enrollment. These strategies are known to work with gifted and talented learners. So that's what we call an allowable use of Title II funds. But as we have conversations with Title II directors, that section provides just an illustration of how a school district might approach the instructional training to use those strategies that are specifically named in it doesn't require them, but they're there for as examples.
I think what's most powerful about that provision that you said kind of was quoted from the Talent Act is that for the first time in federal policy, it actually starts to talk about the ways to address the needs of gifted and talented students. Not only does it say that states and districts should mind their needs in the needs assessment or in the planning and consultation of how they're going to support that, but it also gives them some hints about some strategies that work, like early entrance into kindergarten or acceleration policies, curriculum compacting, all of these different types of strategies that we know have been effective at supporting students to achieve at even higher levels than they start. I think that there are a few other things in this law that are exciting beyond what's in Title I and Title II, and then maybe a little bit about our hopes and wishes about some funding issues.
Okay. Well, one additional new provision, which did not come from the Talent Act, but should be of interest to the gifted ed community, are the computer adaptive assessment sections back in Title I related to accountability. The new law specifically allows states to develop computer adaptive assessments for accountability purposes. And of course, this community understands the power of computer adaptive assessments to measure mastery of standards at above grade level. States aren't required to do it. Of course, many states are entangled with PARC and Smarter Balanced, but it's there. And as some states are breaking away from the consortia or never part of the consortium in the first place, they may be looking at new state assessments. And so this idea that computer adaptive assessments are possible for accountability purposes is a new opportunity. Another positive thing about that is that the law contemplates that there will be state grants available to support the development of these assessments. So those in our gifted ed community who are assessment folks and work with their state agencies, this will be a provision that they'll want to explore with their state departments of education.
We can really thank Senator Franken for some of that language that got in there to allow for computer adaptive assessments to test students who might be achieving above grade level in our case, so that we can really fine tune where they are and how we can support them to get to the next level.
Right. I know that many school districts use some pretty well-known tests that are computer adaptive, but of course they're for formative purposes and not for accountability purposes. So it's a very promising development. And of course, let's keep in mind that not every single thing in ESSA is going to kick off on January 1st, 2016. Some of these things will evolve over time. Certainly any development of new assessments is going to take time and will take multiple years of funding. But again, these are statements from Congress about the way they'd like to see things proceed. These provisions wouldn't be in there if some members of Congress didn't think that this approach wasn't a powerful tool. So keep that in mind for those of you who are in the assessment community, we'll call. And although I saved it for last, and we don't mean it last, because in many ways it's first, and that's the Javits program. The Javits program was first included in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1988. And all but 2 years, the program has received funding. And the community knows about the National Research Center and the demonstration grants that are the heart of the Javits program. The good news is the Javits program was retained in the final version in the conference committee report. The House had deleted the program and the Senate retained the program. So in the end, the program was retained. It has a few tweaks from its last iteration. There's one partial negative to the tweak, and that's to say that while it retains the National Research Center and it retains the demonstration grants, it does not retain the specific statewide grants. On the flip side of that negative is that for the uses of funds, there's a section that says that funds may be used for innovative projects and so on. So there's still the possibility that state education agencies will be eligible for grants to do the kinds of projects that state grants were issued last year under the current Javits program. The one other interesting thing that's been changed is that the research has to be coordinated with the Institute of Education Sciences, and that's probably a very good thing, so that the Javits program isn't just hanging out there on the end of the research branch, that instead it can be discussed and thought about in connection with some of the other initiatives in the research arm of the department. So the Javits program will continue. We're really excited about that. Everyone knows that not every member of Congress thinks that education research is worth the investment, but we were successful in persuading members of Congress that there isn't really a better way to develop state-of-the-art classroom practices. We need to keep all of that information updated all the time. So,
and in truth, some of the beginnings of the U.S. Department of Education and federal investment has always been about conducting research and disseminating that information so that schools can make use of these kinds of innovations. And Javits is one example of where that has succeeded the most, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I mean, we have a body of evidence that the department has identified as important enough to share with the nation. We know that many of the grant projects have developed new assessment instruments that are used all over the country, curriculum used in every district in the nation. Some of the projects have been replicated and supported by, for example, the National Science Foundation. So with a small amount of money, the community has managed to wring out remarkable results. I saw today on the APA listserv, Dr. Ann Robinson from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, her project that is funded by the Javits program was mentioned in a blog from the Boston Science Museum, an initiative. And the blog posting reminded all of us who understand that giftedness doesn't always manifest itself quickly or regularly among children, but I was fascinated by the remarks again that teachers doubted the Javits program folks, suggesting that first graders could do a pretty complex task, and the teachers were skeptical. And like every Javits grantee, it seems, Anne has bumped into those kind of teachers and proved them to have incorrect assumptions about what their children are capable of doing. So it's a reminder. The Javits program provides that constant push that kids can do more than teachers and principals expect they can do. So
very exciting that we have that opportunity to continue this strong program, but also an opportunity for advocates to continue to ask their members of Congress in the appropriation cycle, right?
Right, you bring up the funding. We have some good news actually to share. The Advocacy for Gifted Students has really focused on only getting funds for the Javits program over the years, and now things have changed in some ways, because when ESEA changed and the provisions that we've been talking about were added, those won't require additional funds in order to implement the gifted education sections. The Title I funds and the Title II funds will be coming to states and districts. $15 billion in Title I and $2.5 billion or 2.7 billion or something similar for Title II. We're talking a lot of money, obviously. And with that money comes those requirements that we discussed. There are, however, programs in ESEA that are discretionary programs, right? They're not required to be done every year. They are only implemented when there's funds for them. And the Javits program is one of those programs. So that doesn't change. We will continue to have to advocate annually for funds for the Javits program. And the state, the section of the law that's about funds that will support the development of assessments at the state level, that will also have to be funded every year. That is, that's all separate from the formula grant programs. The Javits program is currently funded at $10 million, and that's fiscal 2015. Fiscal year 2016, which began on October 1st, is about to wrap up in Congress. And you may have read or heard that the negotiators in the Congress have come to an agreement, and we hope that will be voted on by the House and Senate and passed by tomorrow close of business. The good news for the gifted education community is that the funding level for the Javits program has been increased to $12 million, and that is the largest amount of money the program has ever received since 1988.
And that really is a vote of confidence for the power and the impact of this very small program that has a national impact on teaching, on students, on schools. So that's great to hear, and we hope to hear the House of Representatives moving that bill forward.
Right, tomorrow, we hope. And if not tomorrow, the next deadline they've set for themselves will be early next week. But we expect to close the book on appropriations for fiscal year 16 by Christmas. All of this are Christmas gifts for the gifted ed community.
Well, I think now that we've gone over some of the provisions that exist in the law, there are a lot of questions out in the field about this 7-day-old law. Right. Of course, we can't answer all of them, and I don't think that even the U.S. Department of Education or the U.S. Congress could answer all of them at this point, since we're so early in implementation. But there are some questions that we've received that I want to pose to you, and then we'll turn to the audience that has been some tweeting some questions and offering some questions on YouTube and Google+. So let me repeat that again. The way you can submit your questions are by going to the Join the Conversation button on YouTube, or you can tweet hashtag NAGC lowercase q 17. And then finally, you can email at chealy@nagc.org. But just to start things off, some of the questions that we have received are, why don't I give you an easy one first?
Okay. Please.
Where can we get a hold of the law?
Thank you. We put together some resources. Many of you have seen the page on the NAGC website, and we'll continue to add on that page. But if you go to the NAGC website and search for Every Student Succeeds Act, that would be the fastest way to get there. There are probably a half a dozen links, including a link to the conference report itself. And that's 1,061 pages. So for those of you who have paper that needs to be wasted, go ahead. It's a PDF.
Some of us actually like to print those all out, and it's not wasted. It's still on my desk.
I know. It is formidable. We'll say that. And there's some other basic documents there. I also included links to the actual roll call vote, so you can just see what members of Congress supported and opposed the final passage. Of course, that wasn't related to gifted and talented learners. That wasn't the question. But and for your congressional delegations, if you're interested to see who supported the final passage. So the links to those things are on that page. And the other thing that might be more useful is all of the gifted ed provisions that I talked about today, and the actual legislative language is on a separate sheet. So you can, I think it's 3 pages long. So that's available, of course, for download too. So
here's another interesting question that I thought was surprised by, but also interested in. Was the AP test, the advanced placement test fee reimbursement retained in this law?
Yes, that's the short answer. Many, of course, of our gifted ed coordinators and state directors manage the AP program. So there's a lot of interest in particularly the test fee subsidy program, because, of course, it allows low-income students to receive funds in order that they can sit for the AP exams. And this is connected, of course, to the hope that if they achieve a high enough score on the AP exam, they can receive college course credit for it. So that was the origin of that program. It has been retained. It is in a program, or in a section of ESSA called Direct Student Services. And funds from that section, which will have to be appropriated separately every year by the Congress, allows the funds to be used for a number of things, including AP and IB test fees. And I pulled out one of the things from it, which I think is new language, and if so, it's very exciting. Enrollment for students in advanced courses not otherwise available at a student's school. So we could imagine that in a low-income community, there might be an opportunity for the brightest kids to take, an online AP class, or a class through Stanford, or because it's not, or a language class that isn't available in their own school. So, but all the funds are commingled. So a school district has the option on how they're going to spend those dollars. So the AP program isn't an individual standalone program any longer.
But it's a way, this part of the law is really a way to support the needs of those advanced learners to go to even higher heights in terms of the knowledge that they're exposed to and acquiring that new information and experience. So that's pretty exciting. Why don't we turn to the audience, all of you out there that have submitted some questions on Twitter or Facebook or some of the other places, and I'm going to turn to Kathleen Healy, who's going to read out some of your questions.
Okay, there were several questions about how can we persuade school systems to budget Title I, and are there any requirements that they, quote, must use some Title I funds for gifted and talented?
You want to start out with that question?
Well, I can start with the second part first. And the answer is no. School districts do not have to use Title I funds for gifted. It is one of the allowable uses they may use, and that's what the law specifically says, may use their funds to support the identification and provide services for gifted and talented learners. So that's the important part, is that they may. What's probably most important is that many schools have never considered that they have gifted and talented students to begin with. This is, to me, is the most powerful part of this provision. It provides that opportunity to go and ask the school district, what are we doing for our gifted and talented learners in Title I settings? And there may or may not be a satisfactory answer. If like Ann Robinson's engineering project, you'll bump into educators who sadly think they don't have any gifted and talented students. So it will become an education opportunity, and it may take some time, but how would one persuade a school? Well, first, when the data comes from the new report card and the disaggregation about how low-income children are, how many or how few are achieving at the advanced level in the school district, there's the opportunity to talk about how do we change our instruction and our teacher preparation practices so that we can change those figures and make sure that more children in poverty in this school district achieve at higher levels on the state assessment or at the advanced level.
I would say that it also empowers parents whose students may be in Title I school-wide programs or targeted assistant schools, that they really have the opportunity to say, hey, my child needs a little bit more rigor or needs exposure to advanced content. And they can have that conversation with their school leaders and the district level folks as well to say, we need more. Our child may need something different. And you have the ability through this federal funding to support programs that my child might need.
Right, the lack of funds can't be the excuse any longer, exactly. Or I should say the prohibition on the use of funds can't be an excuse any longer. You're allowed to use some of those Title I money now to do for the high ability students in the school system. So again, it's going to be an education process.
So just as I said at the beginning, where ESEA went through an evolution process of focusing on equity very first, but maintain that throughout. And then we focused on achievement gaps through No Child Left Behind in a very kind of tight way. And now this law tries to loosen the reins and restore local control and authority. So your point about the advocacy being needed at the local level now, rather than all of the attention being at the federal level, is an important point that our advocates need to know about.
Yeah.
Now, are there other questions?
What about addressing the fact that a standardized assessment does not work for the non-standard population in terms of, quote, real views on this population's needs?
Well, I'm going to start with that, and part of it is we're right to say that students who may be performing above grade level may be beyond the standard test that is being used in the school. I think what this law, ESSA, does is it loosens the reins on the tight testing, even though some of the testing is still required for accountability purposes. But in this new program actually talks about different types of innovative assessments, whether they're formative or different measuring different types of things. And hopefully, if funded, will be used by school districts to think beyond accountability for all, and think about using the assessments, these powerful assessments, to improve instruction. And so maybe getting at the needs that the person who asked the question meant. Gifted students may have different types of measures, and we know that psychometricians every day are innovating on the assessments to make them better and better for all types of students. And hopefully this federal program will allow us to continue that innovation.
From Twitter, Melissa Lawson asks, how will schools be held accountable for effectively challenging gifted students under ESSA? What language mandates it in the law?
Well,
you're first.
Okay, I'll go first. Couple of things. First of all, there is no longer any federal accountability for student achievement. So the progress that districts were held accountable for, student achievement progress, is gone. Accountability is now at the state level. So districts will be accountable to their states and whatever regime the state creates to demonstrate acceptable student achievement or required student achievement. So we're back to a 50-state system rather than a one federal accountability system. Again, the law does emphasize improving student academic achievement. It also references over and over again that things are aligned to state standards. So we can guesstimate that states will focus on practice and student achievement based on what the state standards they've adopted. When it comes to the accountability for gifted student achievement, there is no different accountability. There is not at the federal level or the state level. Gifted students as a group are not being held accountable in any specific way. I would say the best measure of accountability will be that data outcomes that we see of how many students are achieving at the advanced level in the state. And let's just, for argument's sake, say that 3 or 4% are achieving at the highest levels, 3 or 4% of children from poverty, maybe 12 or 13% of children who are white, and then all the other subgroups that fall somewhere in between. That conversation is about the accountability conversation is about why this group of students. So why aren't there more students from poverty? Is it acceptable in this state to have this few students from poverty, for example, achieving at the advanced level? So the public will have to hold school districts and the state accountable for the achievement at the advanced level.
I think the point is you have the tools now. You have created by federal law, by ESSA, the signals that this is a population that must be attended to, whether they come from minority backgrounds, whether they're in high poverty situations. We know that they exist and that they need additional support. So it's a great opportunity for advocates, for parents, for teachers to say that we need to address their the needs of these students.
Well, and also I think one final thought is, although we don't know, it's very possible that states won't throw their current system out. So a state like Colorado that includes growth measures for all children, including gifted and talented learners, in their accountability system, they may retain it. If the gifted education community in the state is vocally in support of that, perhaps that they will. So that in some states, there might be specific accountability for gifted students, but that's on a state-by-state basis.
Okay, one final question from Donna Ford. It is one thing to focus on achievement, another to focus on access. Do you believe that this new act will decrease the underrepresentation of minority and low-income students in gifted education?
We sure hope so. With the fact that this new data that is going to be required to be collected, we will be able to see if there's a disproportionality in the identification of students, or the student. I would say I may have overstepped. Yeah. But staying in subpopulations that are achieving at the highest levels. Right. There's going to be an incentive to support students from all different subgroups, high poverty, minority, to exist and be represented in that high achieving group. I believe that most educators will want to ensure that and not show that bias, but that's one tool that might be there to.
Well, and also although it's the allowable use, opened the door to using your Title I funds in support of gifted and talented students. When we think about as gifted ed advocates, we think about some of the strategies that are currently being used around the country as starter programs, if you will. The programs that are designed to start with young children who are minority children, limited English proficient, and low income, and work with them over multiple years with the sole purpose of helping them be identified for gifted education services, like the Young Scholars Program in Fairfax County, Virginia, and others modeled after that. The whole point of it is to help the very students that Donna is referring to become eligible for advanced coursework and to be identified for gifted and talented programs. So I'd like to believe that the conversations that we now have an invitation to have will lead us in that direction.
And we really have a 1-2 punch. So we have those signals and the allowance to have these conversations prompted by federal law, but then we also have the Jacob Javits program that in many cases has helped us identify strategies, practical strategies to identify and support the needs of gifted students from all populations, English language learners, minority populations, and help them flourish. So with that, we're going to close our questioning period at this point. We'll try to keep this dialogue going online. But I want to ask you a couple more things, if that's okay. And that really is, what are some of the things that advocates can do now?
Well, as we said, we're 7 days into this. So there is going to be a phase-in process. But first, let me emphasize how important it is to accept the idea that the work has just begun. While we were successful and we're proud of the changes that we've been able to secure in support of gifted students, in order to have those provisions be meaningful, in order to change the way districts are doing their work, it's going to take the efforts of an awful lot of advocates around the country. And I know that we have university folks and professionals in state departments of education, and we have state affiliate group leaders on here. Everyone has a role in educating educators at the state and local level. I'd say the first thing to do is to gather information. And so, for example, who are the individuals at the state or at the local level who are responsible for Title I programs, for Title II programs, because we need to educate them about the changes in the law and ask them questions like, for example, with Title I, who will be responsible to ensure that districts know they can use Title I funds to identify and serve gifted students? And how can the gifted ed community in each state support those state employees and local employees to ensure that for those districts that are willing to make a change, that they're actually implementing good gifted ed practices?
So what ESSA means to me is opportunity. There's opportunity that's created by the law, but an opportunity for all of us advocates of students with extraordinary gifts and talents to continue our advocacy for them. So with that, I want to conclude and thank you for your decade of support for gifted and talented children, and really helping us succeed in this federal way to start this conversation. Thank you, all of you who joined us, and just as a reminder, this webcast will be rebroadcast on YouTube on that link that we shared. So thank you very much for spending time with us.
Thank you.